In this workshop, we're going to be exploring portraits and self-portraiture. Now, like in the last two workshops, you're going to need a sketch pad and pens or pencils, something to draw with, but you're also going to need modelling clay, which we'll be working with later on. So I'll talk a little bit about the theme of self-portraiture and what we're going to explore in this workshop. Now, as I say, we're thinking about portraits, self-portraits, and how we represent ourselves. I think when we think about self-portraits, we immediately jump to what we look like or what we can see. We have a tendency to focus on visual representation before anything else. I'm presuming that as you're watching this video, you're probably a sighted person, and so what you can see is probably the sense that you go to when you think about self-portraiture. Certainly when I think about self-portraiture, my mind jumps to sort of a sketch or a painting of the artist by the artist. So a sketch like Lucian Freud. When you think about Frida Kahlo, you think of her self-portraits. And these are normally sort of fairly accurate representations of the artist. Like, they might be a little bit exaggerated, but they're still focusing on what they can see. And sometimes artists will include sort of elements or symbols to sort of expand that meaning of self. So in Frida Kahlo's pictures, she's including animals or certain plants to sort of add symbolism and extend what she's trying to communicate through her self-portrait. But again, it's coming back to what she actually just looks like most of the time. And I think today this has actually become even more extreme because of the way that we use social media. So because people are using TikTok or Instagram, it's all about video footage, it's about photographs, editing photographs of yourself. Like, when we think about ourselves now, we tend to define it almost completely by what we look like, the clothes that we're wearing, our identity, what we're performing. It comes back to appearance, it doesn't go much deeper than that. But because these workshops are trying to think a little bit more about our physical presence and about the fact that we are physical things with bodies, I'm hoping that today we're going to be able to focus a little bit on other aspects of ourselves, focus maybe even other senses and other sensations when we're representing ourselves. Because in addition to what you look like, you're also how you're feeling today. You're also, if you have a headache, if you're in a good mood, if you're in a bad mood. And I don't think we tend to think about these things until something goes wrong. You don't really think about how your sort of legs or how you relate to parts of your body until you, say, for example, break your arm or trip over something, stub your toe. We tend to forget that we're also kind of material things existing in the world, in addition to being a brain, which is obviously taking in lots of information all the time. And as I say, generally recording information through sight mainly. And so on your worksheet, there's a little bit more information about this, but this is why we're going to be looking at Feldenkrais today. So Moshe Feldenkrais is an exercise therapist. He used to work a lot with people who have sort of spinal problems, maybe work with dancers a little bit. And the basis of his idea is basically that there's an actual tangible connection between your body and your brain, and that actually we sort of program ourselves with that connection. So we get into habits, physical habits, and these physical habits, these ways of moving that we tend to adopt over time, have an effect on our brains, basically, and the way that we respond to situations. And he believed by sort of exploring these sort of dormant places in your mind through changing the way that you used your body, you'd have more energy, that you'd be able to move in a more comfortable way, but also it would change your psychological state because the things were so interconnected. So for example, postures are a really good way of sort of thinking about this. Do you, as a tall person, responding to your environment, end up walking around sort of very stooped over, trying to make yourself smaller? And over time, sort of that sort of posture that we adopt ends up sort of affecting the way that we approach situations. And Feldenkrais also speaks a little bit about how society's expectations, again, can start to affect the way that we move. To some extent, gender identity plays into this a little bit, how men and women choose to move, or when you're trying to be more feminine, how you move, and if you're trying to be more masculine, how do you move? One of his sort of famous examples of this is a complication that girls often end up coming into, which is that on the one hand, they're being encouraged to sort of look really attractive, really feminine. Maybe they're going to be wearing heels, they want to sort of walk really upright. He talks about sort of, pushing your chest out or holding our stomachs in. But at the same time, in the back of your head, you have this sort of awareness that you don't want to be sort of too sexy, or that you've got this sort of parental image telling you off in your head, being told by society not to over-sexualize yourself. Your family don't want you to over-sexualize yourself. So it's sort of interesting the way that we start to sort of get stuck in these conscious and unconscious thought patterns, and the way that that impacts on the way that we hold ourselves, the way that we move in the world. It's a sort of physical, mental connection. Now, if you want to find out some more about Feldenkrais, as I say, we have the worksheet. There's actually an example of him leading a session there where he sort of refers to 3 things that he thinks sort of unconsciously dominate the way that we as people and as animals are always moving. So the video there is in your worksheet, which you can access and watch in your own time. So we're going to draw a little bit on this idea and actually eventually come to work on a portrait where we're going to be focusing on sensation as a way of recording our body instead of using sight. But we'll start with a couple of exercises which are probably a bit more familiar. That is, we'll be sketching sort of our appearance by looking at a mirror. So make sure you've got some way of sort of seeing yourself for this drawing exercise. And we're going to do a sketch for 5 seconds. So I'll put the timer on. It's going to be really quick, just a really quick sketch looking at yourself. 5 seconds. Okay, starting now. Okay, that's it. So we're going to continue with this sort of quick recording exercise. We're going to have 10 seconds this time to do a self-portrait. So I'll start the timer now. That's 5 seconds. And 10 seconds, finished. Okay, so hopefully you're sort of loosening up a little bit here. Again, like the first workshop we did, these don't need to be perfect drawings. We're obviously sketching really quickly. So now we're going to do a slightly longer drawing, and we're going to change again the way that we do this. So we'll do this for about 2 minutes, but I don't want you in this self-portrait to take your pen or pencil off the paper. So it's got to be produced through a sort of continuous line. Hopefully this is going to make you sort of think a little bit more before you start. Maybe change the way you actually look at yourself and that connection between seeing and recording information. So I'll start the timer, 2 minutes, don't take your pen off the paper. Starting now. So we're about halfway through now. Okay, and that's 2 minutes, time's up. So 3 quite quick drawing exercises there for us, and we're going to move on to clay now, which is the sort of main activity for this session. So with the clay that we're working with today, we're going to be producing self-portraits, but as I say, we're going to be focusing on sensation over what we can see. When I worked with this method to produce some little maquettes myself, I decided that the best way for me to do this was just to sit very, very still and actually begin the exercise with a couple of minutes where I wasn't really moving or modelling at all. and just to see sort of like, where my weight was in the way that I was sat. Was it more on my back, more underneath me? Whether my feet were something I was paying attention to. The scale in these models is probably going to be quite messed up. When I did some of these portraits, I wasn't feeling particularly well that day, and my stomach, having just eaten like lunch and not feeling great, was the thing that I was really, really sort of aware of. That was the thing that felt uncomfortable for me, the thing that ended up being sort of the largest part of one of these sculptures. On that day, I didn't really feel like my feet were there at all because I was so absorbed with the way that my tummy was feeling. And I don't want you to shy away from doing things like cutting into your models, really scoring into sections. It doesn't matter if these portraits look quite abstract at the end of the process. We're not expecting them to really look like, how we appear in the world. That's kind of the whole point. And you might find that you actually produce a model quite quickly, and that you want to change position whilst you're modelling. So maybe you want to start by doing this exercise actually sat at a chair, at a desk, in a sort of very formal academic way, like you're watching a video, you're learning, you're studying. Produce a sculpture like that, and then maybe halfway through change over, move onto the floor, have a little think. What part of your body are you noticing more? Maybe what part of your body do you feel really self-conscious about? Do you want to reduce that, or do you feel inclined to make that really, really large because it's something that you don't like and you feel like it stands out to other people? And if there are parts of ourselves that we feel self-conscious about, they may end up being the largest part of the entire sculpture. So maybe you feel really self-conscious about your nose. That might be the thing that you're just so focused on when you're actually sat there thinking about, what part of myself do I pay attention to? So, working on clay. Might be a good idea, if you haven't got a tablecloth, to at least put a board down, just something on the table so you don't get everything covered in clay. I'm assuming everyone's worked with clay before, but obviously it can be quite sticky when you get it fresh out of the bag. Now I've got a massive bag of clay here. I'm assuming you're going to have a slightly smaller portion. Now if your clay is feeling particularly sticky, maybe pause the video, give it a couple of minutes just to dry out. Sometimes when it's come out of a plastic bag, it can end up actually being like so sticky that you can't work with it. It might be worth actually dividing up your pieces of clay to start with. Now I found with the maquettes that I made using this process, ended up being very different scales depending on actually where I was working. Piece that I made when I was stood up ended up being really, really large. The one I was making when I wasn't feeling very well ended up being really small because I really wasn't focusing on like my legs or my arms at all. I was so preoccupied with not feeling very well. Now you should have been given some modelling tools for this workshop. I really recommend using these. Obviously, when you're modelling, you're going to be making sort of broad shapes. We were talking about scale with different sections where there may be your head ends up being something that's sort of absolutely enormous for you. But you can also put texture into these pieces. Is there something that you can do to sort of demonstrate or try and communicate a particular sensation? So like slashing the clay, what does that sort of communicate to somebody who's looking at it afterwards? Or if you've got a really deep-seated ache somewhere, or maybe you're nervous, like what does that feel like? Is it a really deep hole? Maybe it's something sticking forward. Maybe it'll be something that you're sort of building separately and sort of laying over the top of a section. It's how we communicate sensation through the material. This idea of material holding an idea is really interesting. The artist Michelangelo, by taking away material in his carvings, always believed that he was sort of revealing the true form of the thing that he was producing. He has these famous carvings of slaves in which he's sort of, in the process of stone carving, chipping away and revealing the form. This was a really important thing for him, this idea that the idea was already there in the stone and he was just revealing it. And some contemporary artists have actually responded to this. The sculptor Anthony Gormley produced works where he actually did a cast of his own body, but it's inside the cement. So a complete reverse of this idea of Michelangelo is that the idea was in the material and you had to get to it. Anthony Gormley decided to reverse it and actually put himself inside the material. As I say, we're not trying to make portraits that look like ourselves. We're trying to get together a portrait that really responds to sensation. And I want you to think about how you communicate sensation with a material. So I'm going to start the timer now for 30 minutes. I will interject to give you a little nudge when we're halfway through. Encourage you to change position if that's something that you feel like doing over the course of this session. So starting the timer now for 30 minutes. We're going to spend sort of 5 minutes now, like we've done in the past, just reflecting and evaluating this exercise. First of all, did you enjoy working with the clay? Is clay something that you normally work with, or are you more of a draftsman? Maybe you preferred the first exercises. Are you actually pleased with the sculpture that you've produced? Do you think aesthetically it's actually quite interesting? Because we weren't trying to make something that actually looked like us. How did this affect the way that you were working? Did you feel more relaxed? Or was it frustrating? Are you not really pleased with the result? And what do you think about this Feldenkrais method? Do you think there's a link between our bodies, the way that we move around, the way that we're thinking? And do you think that you can tap into sort of some hidden self-confidence by changing the way that you move, or certainly thinking about the way that you move? So I hope that was really interesting for you. I hope it sort of made you think a little bit more about, as I say, your physical body and your relationship to that.